Hey, what's up YouTube? Dan the Fix-It Man. Got another quick video here for you. I'm going to show you how to change your rear brake pads and your rear brake rotors. This is actually a rotor drum combo on a 2016 GMC Sierra. Now the first thing we need to do is pull this caliper off, and that's held in place by these two 13mm slide pin bolts. Now when you loosen and remove these, the slide pin itself has a hex shaft right here, and that might spin. So you may need to get a 20mm open end wrench to hold that in place while you loosen these with the 13mm socket. I'm just going to see if I can break them loose here with the Milwaukee. We'll just set those aside. Now we can take off the caliper. Luckily this one's pretty loose. It's a good idea to take a look at the piston and the boot here, and everything looks okay. I'm just going to set it right up here on the leaf spring out of the way, and then we can pull out the old brake pads. You can see they're completely worn down, including this one here. This has the little squealer. It looks like this was actually rubbing on the surface of the rotor, causing some noise. The next thing we need to do is pull off this caliper bracket. All right, now we can break loose these 18mm head bolts here. These are holding on this caliper bracket, and these are on there pretty good. So I'm going to try the big 1/2" Milwaukee impact here with just a little universal wobble there. See if we can get it. Yeah, those are in there good. See if we can get this bottom one. Got it. And it helps to grab this with your other hand so it doesn't drop to the ground. Just know that you might need a big impact or a long breaker bar in order to break these loose. All right, now to get this rotor off, if it's never been off, you'll have these little clips here, and those are, I guess, to hold the rotor on during manufacturing or during the assembly. Just try to get under one or two of these little flaps of metal. If you can just get underneath one or two of them, you might be able to just back these out. But I guess you can just unthread it like a nut, but that worked. Make sure that you take the parking brake off, otherwise you'll never get this off. If it's stuck, you can also get a couple threaded bolts and put them in there, and as you turn them in, it's almost like a force screw or a press. It'll press this off the hub. In our case, it looks like it's just going to come right off, so let's just wiggle that and work it off. And here's your parking brake shoes. Now we're going to clean this with some brake clean and just make sure that everything looks good. On the driver's side, this little adjuster is going to be at the bottom. This is just a little star wheel adjuster to adjust your parking brakes out. The parking brake is working fine in this vehicle. It's possible that I won't need to adjust it, but if you do need to, you can always pull this little rubber plug in the back, and you can put a little screwdriver in there after you get the drum back on, and you can tighten that. So I'm going to clean the rust off of the surface of this hub right here with just a wire wheel. Now if you're going to use a wire wheel on a drill like I do, make sure that you wear some safety glasses or some sort of eye protection. Now that didn't really clean it all off, but it's enough to where I think that the new rotor is going to now sit flush to that hub. And we're just going to hit this with a little bit of anti-seize just to prevent that rotor from sticking. That's probably good. All right, so here's our new rotor. You can see this has got some sort of an oil or grease on it just to prevent rusting, and so we're going to clean that off with some brake clean, but I'm also going to clean off these brake shoes before I put the rotor on. I like to not spray too much in there or saturate that too much, because the glue or whatever that bonds those shoes to the backing plate, I don't want that to separate. So I use very little here just to kind of knock some of that dust off, and that looks pretty good. Okay, now we can put the new rotor drum combo on. Now before we can put the caliper bracket back on, we need to take out these clips and clean underneath there and put on the new clips, and then we're also going to pull out these slide pins and clean and re-grease them. And we can start just by popping off this brake hardware here. These are just called abutment clips. This has a little spring on this side, and this one here has one on this side. Looks like there are or were springs on the other side, and it looks like they're broken off completely. That would make sense. I think that these brake pads have just worn out so far that those clips broke off, and that was probably pinched or trapped in between the pad and the rotor. The owner was hearing a lot of metal to metal noise, and if you look over here at our brake rotor, you can see there's a little score there. It wasn't the backing plate that was grinding on that. It was probably just that little tab. Now the rotor was still in terrible shape, and so I'm glad we changed it. But that right there is probably what the owner was hearing, is these little tabs probably broke off and they got trapped between the pad and the rotor for a period of time. He said that the noise eventually went away, and I thought it was maybe the brake squealer that had eventually broken off. That does happen sometimes. But you can see that the brake squealer is still here, intact on the old pad. Really not much left here, but that's what was probably continuing to make a little bit of noise. But if that little tab on the brake abutment clip broke off and got trapped between the pad and the rotor, that would have made a lot of noise, and that makes sense. I'm going to use the wire wheel on this bracket again, so just remember those safety glasses. Just using a little bit different wheel this time to get in this little channel right here. If you don't clean these out or make sure that they don't have any corrosion in there, those clips won't sit flush, and then your brake pads will be too tight. They won't be able to move freely. That looks pretty good. We don't have a lot of rust in this area, so it doesn't take much effort for us. But if you got a lot of heavy corrosion on there, you might even need to use a little file or something to break that loose. Before I put the clips on here, I'm going to brush them with a little bit of this caliper grease. Now, this does say prevents brake squeal, extends brake life, prevents rust and corrosion. This will at least prevent a little bit of rust or corrosion underneath here. This is also really good to use on slide pins. And you can see our new clips do have the little tabs on both sides. So we just drop these in place. Same with the other side. Just make sure that they're nice and flush or seated so that we're not going to have any issues with the brakes binding. Now we can pull out these slide pins. You can see there's still plenty of grease there, but we'll clean that up and put in some new grease. You want to inspect the slide pin and make sure that it's not pitted or corroded or anything. These are actually in great shape still. Sometimes I'll put these back in once or twice just to try to get out some more of the old grease. Now, if these are really stuck or corroded, you'll have to clean out this recess in here where these go. Now, you can roll up a little rag or paper towel and stuff it in that little recess and spin that. That's one way that you can clean those out. If these are really bad, you can clean them out with some brake cleaner. I've got some other brushes now too, but these aren't really all that bad. So we're just gonna get some new grease in there. I'm gonna use this same caliper grease here. I like to use this stuff on the slide pins. It works really well. Now, you can't just use any grease. Petroleum-based grease gets hot and it will get real sticky and gummy, and it won't work. This stuff works really well. You can see that that's perfect right there. Okay, now we'll do this side here. Same thing, just pop it out, clean it off. And we'll just use a little paper towel here to stuff that in there. And it seems to work pretty well. It at least wipes out any of the major junk in there. You see the little lip right there? This will catch that boot as you push it back in. And then pop that back in. Now, sometimes you'll get a little bit of air trapped in there. You might have to push that as you spin it and squeeze it and make sure that everything comes out, but this is ready to go back on. All right, now before we put that caliper bracket on, you're really supposed to clean this off and apply new thread sealant. This stuff still looks like it's pretty good shape, and I'm gonna have to reuse these because I don't have any yellow thread sealant or red. All I have is the blue. I think it's gonna hold just fine. I'm really not too worried about it. So let's go ahead and put this bracket back on. I'm just gonna zip those on real quick. All right, and the torque spec on this is 148. That's why they're so hard to take off. Well, that is not easy to get to that torque, but it is doable. I just kind of had to have the torque wrench in here and reach around the other way. So, all right, and then we can grab the new pads and we can put those in place. Now, here's where I like to use this higher temp stuff. This is the Silicone Ceramic Extreme by Permatex. And I just like to put a little bit of that on the back of the shim. It's this weird orange color, but it seems to really cut down on some of that vibration. I've always used a little bit of brake grease on the back, but the other stuff would heat up so much, a lot of times it would just melt right off. And you don't want to use too much because that can just attract dust, but just something like that. And then just pop it in here like that. For the inside pad, you want to make sure that you match the metal squealer or noisemaker here, just like on the other side. So that was on the inside at the top. Do the same thing, just a real thin coat here and a little bit at the ends. That just kind of helps it slide in that little channel without getting bound up. There we go. Before we can put the caliper back on, we need to push the caliper piston back in. And before I do that, I like to pop the hood and take a look at the master cylinder. Make sure that the brake fluid level is low enough that when we push that back in, we're not going to overflow and make a big mess. So let's go take a look real quick at that. So here's our master cylinder, and you can see that our brake fluid level is about halfway between minimum and maximum. So we've got enough room, we can push the caliper piston back without having to remove any fluid or without worrying about that overflowing. A lot of people ask me if you need to remove this cap when doing so, and you really don't. Anything that's trapped in here as far as air or pressure can still release out the cap. And because brake fluid absorbs moisture, even moisture in the air, and that causes it to degrade, I usually just leave it on. Let's go ahead and push that caliper piston back in now. Now, in order to make room for the new thicker pad material, we need to push this brake caliper piston back inside the caliper. There's a couple different ways to do that. You can use a C-clamp, even some large channel locks or vice grips will work. I've got this little wind back tool. This works pretty well. You just put it right in here with an old brake pad, and that will push against the surface of that piston and press it back in. Here's the old brake pad we're going to use. Now, when you do this, remember, you just need to double check and make sure that you have room in the master cylinder, so you're pushing the fluid backwards through your hydraulic system up into there. If it's really full or someone's been topping it off, you might have to remove some. Or as another method, you can also take this rubber cap off and crack this bleeder screw loose, which will push out the old fluid while you do this. Because you're opening the system, though, you would have to bleed the brakes when you're done. This way, pushing it backwards through the system, there's not a reason or a need to bleed the brakes. We're not opening the hydraulic system or allowing any air to enter. Question I get a lot is, do you need to bleed the brakes after doing this? And in this case, you do not. There we go. Not a bad idea to brush a little bit of that same grease here on this outside edge of the caliper where it's going to make contact with the brake pad or the back of the brake pad, and just a little bit on the face here of the caliper piston. Seems to help just really cut down on the noise. Now, when we put the caliper back on, it's very important that you don't twist this brake line. You see how it's nice and straight through here? If you twist it or rotate this around, I've seen people do that. A lot of times their brakes will pull or one side won't work. So just make sure that that's straight and then you can put it on. Now, because these little pad retainer clips or the abutment clips push the pads outward, you might have to squeeze those a little bit like so before you put the caliper back on. Let's just see if I can do that with that hand and just get the caliper over there. Perfect. And then also these slide pins, sometimes you have to pull in on those just enough to get that to lock in place. Now, I want to show you guys something. These slide pins that I cleaned and greased, you see that right there? I've noticed that when you push them in, they still push out a bit. And I've been squeezing on that, trying to burp out any of the grease. Let's take this caliper back off and set it up here for a second. But they're just not pushing out any air. So I'm just gonna get this little pick or hook and try to pull that boot back just a little bit while I push in, and then let it go, and there you go. You can see I got all of the air out now. Same with this one. You see down below, I'm pushing that, but it's just not allowing that to burp or get that air out. So just gently with the hook, pull that out, push the slide pin in, and then you can see they're now seated in all the way where they should be, and they're sliding and spinning freely. The issue is if I would have left that, these would push out a little. It might be okay, but these would push out a little bit, and that would cause your brake pads to drag. So I'm glad I caught that, but just a quick little tip there. Now we can put the caliper over here and pull those slide pins in a little bit. That feels a lot better. I can see that those slide pins are now not pushing out. And then we can put in the slide pin bolts. Again, these have got a lot of thread lock on here already. I'm just gonna put them in like that. Partially because I don't have the yellow. If you have the right thread lock, go ahead and clean them off and replace. In my case, I don't. I'm just going to put them in like that. I'm sure they'll be fine. Let's just get those started. And then I'm just going to zip these on real quick. Now you can see that slide pin wants to spin. I've still gotten it to tighten because of the speed of this ratchet, but if that spins on you, you can just grab a 20mm open end, put it on there. That'll hold it steady while you tighten it. Same thing for the bottom one here. So the torque spec I found online is 38 foot-pounds for this, and this is my gear wrench 85062 torque wrench that I'm using. I'm just gonna hold that slide pin with this. And you're done. Now, before you head out, it's very important that you step on the brake pedal several times, which will push the caliper piston back out, pressing those pads up against the rotor where they need to be. When you do that, make sure that you don't press all the way to the floor. Just press it down about halfway several times until it feels firm. If you go all the way to the floor, you can damage the seals in the master cylinder. And on this one, since we also changed the rotor, it's very important to double check your parking brake. Parking brake is too loose or it's not holding, you can reach in from behind, pull that little rubber plug that I showed you, and then you can just use a flathead screwdriver in there and push that star wheel to adjust it tighter. And go ahead and double check your fluid level in the master cylinder as well. Make sure that that's all topped off where it needs to be. I hope you liked the video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you don't mind. That does help me out. I'll get a link in the description to some of the parts and tools used in the video as well. Thanks so much for watching, and good luck.